Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good morning. Good morning to all of you. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the International Peace Institute and to this year's Trygve Lie Symposium on Fundamental Freedoms, organized in partnership with the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Named after the first Secretary General of the UN, Trygve Lie, the symposium explores ways in which the international community can strengthen its promotion and protection of human rights. Today's discussion will focus on the theme of civil society's crucial contribution to promoting and protecting human rights. In order for human rights to flourish, a strong and active civil society is critical and should be supported. An involved civil society is essential for the success of rules-based global governance. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the UN Declaration of Human Rights Defenders championed by Norway. It also marks the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, drafted to complement the UN Charter. Its adoption was representative of a vow by the newly rebirthed international community to commit itself to the creation and strengthening of a world that respects the dignity and rights of all human beings. It is my pleasure to welcome Douglas Rutzen, President of the International Center for the Not-for-Profit Law, who will moderate today's important and timely discussion. I'm honored to welcome our distinguished panelists, Her Excellency, Ms. Anniken Huitfeldt, Foreign Minister of Norway, Hina Jilani, who is joining us virtually and is a fellow member of the Elders. She is an advocate at the Supreme Court of Pakistan, a member of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom, and founder of Pakistan's first all-women law firm. Lisa John, Secretary General of Civicus, and Ulrika Mudir, UN Assistant Secretary General and Director of the Bureau of External Relations and Advocacy at UNDP. The biographies of this distinguished panel are in your program. It's now my great pleasure to hand the reins of this year's Trygve Lie Symposium over to Doug Rutzen. Doug, the floor is yours.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first, I thank you, Zaid, for your articulate opening, and I thank IPI for hosting us today. We have an eminent panel, so we will move briskly to their remarks. Our first speaker is the Norwegian co-host of today's event, the Foreign Minister of Norway, Anniken Huitfeldt. Anniken has a distinguished career in politics. You've been a lifelong champion of women's rights and equality throughout your personal life and your career. We are grateful to Norway and to you for your leadership on the topic of today's conversation, civil society and human rights. Madam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Excellency, and thanks for inviting me to this all-female panel. And welcome to the Trygve Lie Symposium of Fundamental Freedoms. 127 years ago, a little boy was born in the outskirts of Oslo to working-class parents, or rather a working-class mother, because shortly after his birth, his father, a carpenter, left Norway and came here to United States, and later he cut all ties with his family back in Norway. The little boy and his sister were raised by their mother under very humble conditions. The father who had abandoned them was never ever mentioned. The little boy developed an early interest in politics, and he read newspapers out loud to the workers who visited his mother's small cafe. Thanks to his very hard-working mother, a teacher who recognized his talent, and local benefactors who supported him through school and university, the little boy ended up studying law. He became the first legal advisor to the Norwegian Confederation of Trade Unions, where he quickly earned a reputation as a skilled defender of workers' rights. He later became the Minister of Justice, and it was on his watch that women were finally allowed to hold all public positions in Norway, including in church and in the military. He was later the foreign minister in the government in the exile London during Nazi Germany occupation of Norway. And then the fatherless little boy became the first Secretary General of United Nations. His name was, of course, Trygve Lie. And it was during his term as Secretary General that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted and adopted 75 years ago. As one of the central institutions of the post-World War order, United Nations was built on human rights. It was a very literal sense as well. The cornerstone of the UN headquarters laid by Trygve Lie in 1949 contains a copy of both the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This was not an action based on a far-fetched idealism. After years of war and conflict, it reflected a common belief that human rights form the very foundation of freedom, justice, and also peace. It was an action motivated by realism, not idealism. Because as Trygve Lie put it, experience shows that sooner or later, all dictators start suffering from claustrophobia and start exerting pressure on their neighbors. Over the last 75 years, we have made huge progress in fulfilling human rights. And also in understanding the true meaning of the world, all humans being are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Civil society has always played a key part in moving the agenda forward. I'm pleased to therefore bring together this panel of civil society representative, high-level government, and UN officials and experts. I look forward to discussing the progress we have made and how we can build on this. And yes, there has been progress. But in the past decade, we have seen a decline in respect for democracy, human rights, and rule of law. According to the We-Dem institution, the level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen in 2022 is down to 1986 levels. In other words, advances in global levels of democracy made over the last 35 years have been wiped out in the last decade. So more countries are being authoritarian. Authoritarian leaders are learning from each other, and they often start by winning elections and then using their position to weaken democratic institutions. Today, we are seeing less freedom of expression, in particular for women. There has been a rise in attacks on journalists and media workers. This can also lead to self-censorship. We are also witnessing wider repression of civil society, restrictions on the right to peaceful assembly, and increased media censorship. The right to decide over one's own body is under attack in very many countries. The anti-gender movement has launched a well-coordinated and well-funded effort to undermine sexual and reproductive health and rights. Civil society plays a crucial role in countering this movement. Authoritarianism is a means of compensating for weakness. These so-called strongmen are, in fact, weak, because only weak leaders feel threatened by the freedom of others. Repression and the vast resources needed to maintain it actually shows how effective the media, civil society, and human rights defenders are as checks on power and as drivers of change. This morning, I want to highlight 3 key areas where civil society and human rights defenders have been particularly successful in promoting and protecting human rights. First, civil society's role is in inclusive social services. For example, in schools and health clinics, in hard-to-reach areas, or in refugees or internally displaced communities. This enables the affected population to realize their rights to health and also education. It helps ensure that no one is left behind. Second, civil society's role in because they're pushing for changes of policy or law, either by working with politicians or government institutions or by challenging legislations in courts, such as in Indonesia, where civil society campaigned for more than a decade in support of the passing of the sexual violence bill. The bill finally passed last year. It strengthened the protection of victims and survivors, ensuring their rights to treatment, protection, and restitution. Or, for instance, in Colombia, where a civil society alliance recently brought a case before the Constitutional Court that led to the decriminalization of abortion. And third, civil society's role in expanding our understanding of what equal rights in a changing world actually means. For example, when it comes to the human rights implication of digital technology or human rights impacts of climate change, civil society organizations spread information and raise awareness. They change attitudes and perceptions. There is no clearer example of this than the hard-won recognition of the rights of sexual and gender minorities to privacy, to health, and to family life, simply to be allowed to be who they are. Yet we know that LGBTI persons are still at risk, even in countries where equal rights for LGBTI persons are well established. As we saw during Pride in Oslo last year, where 2 men lost their lives in mass shooting the night before the parade. Women and LGBTI persons are often the first to lose their rights when illiberal leaders undermine democracy, feeding into stereotypes and prejudice to tighten their grip on power. Using political rhetoric that can give rise to more harassment and also discrimination. Discrimination against women not only violates their rights, it also undermines inclusive growth and sustainable development. We know that women's employment can be a central driver of economic growth. In average, GDP per capita would be almost 20% higher if gender employment gap were closed. In short, gender equality, and I know that you agree with me, Magdalena, former Prime Minister of Sweden, gender equality is smart economics. It is therefore a paradox when authoritarian leaders claiming to put development first use restrictions on women's rights, such as access to contraceptives and safe abortions, as a political tool. Colleagues and friends, unlike his father, who never looked back, Trygve Lie returned across the Atlantic after 7 years in what he described as the most difficult job in the world. And he spent the final years of his life in Norway. Today is the International Day of Peace. Trygve Lie never stopped believing that lasting peace could only mean peace with freedom. I am convinced that the global network of civil society, where ideas and know-how travel freely, will continue to play a crucial role in standing up for freedom against authoritarian leaders. Norway will always support civil society and those who defend democracy, gender equality, and human rights. We will continue to do our part. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the other participants in the panel here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I found it fascinating to hear that Trygve Lie was a lawyer and Minister of Justice, and on his watch, women's rights were expanded. But you also pointed out that in too many countries, we see the rule of law being converted into the rule by law to restrict human rights, civil society, and civic space. You've given us much to think about during today's symposium. Thank you for your excellent framing remarks. We will now turn to Hina Jalani, who will be joining us by video. Hina is a Pakistani lawyer and a world-renowned human rights defender. She was also the first special representative of the UN Secretary General on the situation of human rights defenders. Hina, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to your remarks.
Let me thank the Norwegian government and IPI for arranging this symposium. I actually didn't know very much about the person on whose name this the Trygve Lie Symposium is being held. But what you have said earlier, Excellency, I really feel that there have been so many inspiring people who have headed this organization of the United Nations. Yet we are still looking for the goals that were set many years ago. So let's hope that some elements in the governments and others in the civil society can make some difference in the future. Now, before we can speak about the role and contribution of the civil society in promoting and protecting human rights, we have to take stock of the most serious concerns that we confront today. Armed conflict, terrorist campaigns, insurgencies, food crises, long-term political or economic instability have placed human security of vast populations in peril. Large-scale movement of people fleeing from hunger and poverty or escaping various forms of persecution is a continuing crisis that has direct link to social and political repression. The consequences of long-drawn conflicts are encompassing a wider sphere of political and economic interests, making it more challenging than in the past to find acceptable solutions. Collective failure to restore hope for peace and people's security not only has given more critical dimensions to the present-day crisis, but is also a sad indication of a decline in the quality of world leadership. I do recognize that in the past few decades, several countries around the world have emerged or are in the process of transition from authoritarian rule, armed conflict, or struggles for the right of self-determination. Many countries have adopted national constitutions with strong guarantees for the protection of human rights. With a few exceptions, most of these countries have had periods of political stability during which somewhat credible elections were held. Despite these significant advancements, political and economic conditions in many of these countries remain volatile. Some show visible signs of reversal of the initial advancement. Others are trapped in a perpetual state of transition. This is largely due to inadequate attention given to establishing or restoring the rule of law and inculcating a culture of respect for human rights in state institutions, as well as in practices of governance. Social, political, and economic crises are impeding prospects for sustainable democracy, respect for human rights, and the potential for development. Leaders of indigenous and other minority communities, leaders of movements of the poor, environmental and anti-globalization activists, trade union leaders, defenders of the rights of displaced persons, migrants, and refugees, and now even climate activists are increasingly being targeted by state and non-state actors. Such actions have resulted in increased public resentment against authorities and narrowing the space for dialogue, which is the more important thing. The rights of minorities, women's security and freedom, ability of the youth to freely research issues of national and international importance and to exchange ideas, and freedom of the academia are severely restrained, not only by the policies of the state, but by threats from non-state actors as well, who act with impunity in fanning intolerance, vilifying diversity, and encouraging discrimination. Populism has overtaken reason, and we see an increasing number of leaders pandering to such ideologies and impeding all efforts to promote the ideal of shared prosperity and common security amongst the population, or to strengthen endeavors to foster the rule of law and respect for human rights. Severe restrictions on the freedom of information, expression, and assembly imposed particularly in the name of religious ideology or the security or integrity of the state in many countries have limited the access to information and repressed freedom of the media, thereby frustrating attempts to monitor situations and to report violations. While in most countries, the right to freedom of association is constitutionally guaranteed, there has been a notable increase in the number and range of restrictions imposed on the exercise of this right, resulting in serious obstacles in the work of civil society organizations and narrowing the space for the civil society in making its contribution and displaying its role. Human rights experts have acknowledged that the civil society is an essential part of all social and political processes in a democratic dispensation. International human rights law gives recognition to and establishes the principles and standards for the protection, promotion, and realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Inherent in this protection is the guarantee that activities for the promotion and protection of these rights can be conducted without fear and hindrance. The 1998 Declaration on Human Rights Defenders is a step forward in the development of international protection for human rights. Read with other international human rights instruments, it gives shape to the concept of the defense of human rights as not only a right, but also a collective responsibility. This concept sees the state as a guarantor of rights, and in this capacity responsible for ensuring that individuals, groups, and organs of society are able to pursue peaceful activism for the full realization of human rights. No notion of international community is now complete without recognizing that the civil society is a part of what we call the international human rights, international community. I remember that the participation of the civil society in many international human rights events became the reason for the real success of such events. For instance, the anti-personnel Mine Ban Convention in 1997, and the more recent climate change conferences. I remember many years ago at a civil society event, the then Foreign Minister of Canada, Lloyd Axworthy, said something which I still remember and find it still very relevant. He said one can no longer relegate NGOs to simple advisory or advocacy roles in this process. They are now part of the way decisions have to be made. They have been the voice saying that governments belong to the people and must respond to the people's hopes, demands, and ideas. Human rights defenders are not only a part of the democratic process, but their presence and activity in a state is in itself both an indicator of democratization and a motor for its further development. Defenders have played a critical role in sustaining peace and strengthening the prospects for promotion and protection of human rights in post-conflict societies. While support for human rights and democratic structures of the state is slow to emerge, or may even have suffered a reversal in many cases, civil society has demonstrated a strong resolve to resist authoritarianism and oppression. Civil society actors have played a significant role in inducing recognition of the concepts of participatory democracy, transparency, and accountability. Defending rights has a high cost. Their activities for the protection and promotion of human rights exposed human rights defenders to harm, to grievous threats to their life, liberty, security, independence, and credibility. They were subjected to assassinations, disappearances, illegal arrest, detention, and torture in almost every part of the world. A number of human rights defenders are living in self-imposed exile after having to flee their country to safeguard their lives or liberty. Reprisals and repressive measures have been taken against individuals and groups who have reported human rights abuse to international bodies, including the United Nations Human Rights System. Human rights organizations and defenders networks have been particularly stricken as governments have deliberately enforced and used these laws to put an end to human rights activities through legal action. In many countries, security and intelligence units of government not only set registration criteria for NGOs, but also are directly involved in decisions on approval or rejection of what kind of activities these NGOs can conduct. This has been a trend that has assailed independence and autonomy of human rights groups and organizations, and arbitrary declaration of human rights activities as illegal and undesirable has occurred. Such measures are no less than an attempt to undermine the ability of human rights organizations to work with independence and without fear, and that financial resources cannot become a tool that government can block to control the freedom of defenders to operate. In many countries of the world, the situation of women human rights defenders is of particular concern. Their rights are violated in the name of religion and culture, and they become particularly vulnerable to prejudice, to exclusion, and to public repudiation, not only by state forces, but by social actors as well, and sometimes their own families. Thousands of cases have now been recorded from all over the world and from almost all countries that illustrate not only the perils of defending human rights, but also the resilience with which defenders continue to do so. At the same time, it is undeniable that when harm to one human rights defender goes undetected and unpunished, it has a chilling effect on others engaged in activities for the advancement of human rights. This ultimately affects the larger civil society, and their commitment to uphold human rights can be subsumed by fear. Impunity for violation of human rights has become one of the most serious human rights problems and directly affects the ability of national and international human rights systems to promote or protect human rights and fundamental freedoms. Genuine political will to combat impunity requires a degree of diligence on the part of the authorities that allows them to spot vulnerability and address it in an effective and timely manner. Effective judicial systems must be supported by complete judicial independence if people are to draw real benefit from protections that are normally available under a constitutional framework. Such a move forward requires a creative relationship between states and civil society so that people's dignity and security is placed at the center of any approach towards governance. A significant development in recent times is the growing strength and capacity of civil societies in many parts of the world. Civil societies actors have played a significant role in introducing recognition by the state of the rights of people.
Hina, if I may ask you to please wrap up.
I'm just
Thank you.
a last sentence. There are many challenges that are already testing the resolve of the international community to promote accommodation and tolerance in order to prevent erosion of peace and harmony. I fervently hope that such a resolve at the international level leads the world out of the crisis we confront today, and that people learn the value of coexistence and shared progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Hina, for sharing your important frontline perspectives. We will now move to Lisa John, the Secretary General of Civicus, the World Alliance for Citizen Participation. Lisa has championed human rights and international mobilization for 2 decades. We've also had the pleasure of working together on civic space issues. She's a powerful voice in our field. Thank you for joining us, Lisa. The floor is yours.
Well, I'm going to start by apologizing for my voice because I'm one of the few people who didn't expect a Mumbai monsoon style shower at the beginning of the week, and I'm suffering the consequences of that. It's a real honor to be here celebrating the very first Secretary General of the UN while navigating all of the police barricades and clocking like 22,000 steps per day. I keep asking myself, is it really worth getting on a plane, traveling from South Africa to here for 15 hours to do all of this? And the answer is always yes. I mean, this is the one space where we're constantly reminded of the global nature of our, our identity, our issues, but also our solutions. And I think it's always worth coming here and being part of this community and then going back with much more energy and inspiration. So on that note, I'm actually going to start with the good news in terms of civil society and human rights. I know it feels like everything is falling apart, but we wouldn't be here if we weren't focused on the stories of hope and change. So the pandemic has been the one period where the relevance and the resilience of civil society has been more visible and more recognized than any time, at least in my lifetime. I know that in the first few months of the pandemic, I come from India, there were independent studies that said that in a number of countries, civil society reached more people than government machinery did, in India, in South Africa to begin with, and they were the first to respond. The Edelman Trust Barometer, for instance, when they were looking at trends in 2020, also demonstrated that across the pandemic, it was local businesses and local civil society that really were the most trusted institutions by communities across the world. And at one point, in fact, I think as a result of some of the trends I'll talk about later, more people were fearful of losing their individual freedoms than they were of contracting COVID. And I think that really spoke to how much of an issue civic freedom, civic space, the ability to assert your rights became, it was a household issue, and the ability to demand the kind of accountability you needed from duty bearers. So I think that short period of those 3 years has actually created a fundamental shift in the ability of people across generations to understand what civil society does, but also be part of civil society. I come from Civicus. In the last 3 years, we've had a 500-fold increase in our membership, and we do not spend a single dollar promoting ourselves. And it is because most of the people who've joined us are now from repressed or obstructed contexts and young people below the age of 30. And I think the fact that you had bigger, protests and mass movements in the period of lockdown than you've ever seen before. The Indian farmers movement was the biggest mobilization in human history. The Black Lives Matter, we saw how powerful that was. But across countries, you had people organizing on issues of labor, on gender-based violence, on also austerity measures that were being introduced, if you remember when COVID started. So I think just there's a phenomenal explosion of civic action, which is something we really must remember and connect to when we're kind of navigating all of the other restrictions. So that's one scenario that we've really experienced in the last couple of years. The second scenario isn't that great, and I think it's in a way a backlash to a lot of the mobilization we've seen. So the first year of the pandemic, again in 2020, was the year of censorship and surveillance. There were nearly 35 new laws across the world that were introduced to restrict freedom of expression. And you saw all over the world people throwing out these emergency laws to prevent misinformation, where actually there was a very clear attempt to restrict dissent. I'm sure some of us remember health workers and doctors challenging the way that things were done and being facing reprisals all over the world. The second year, the Civicus Monitor, which is a research platform that tracks the status of civic freedoms across the world, in 2021, the highest reported violation was attacks on peaceful protests. And therefore, the second year was really, again, like I spoke about, the year of mobilizing, the year where citizens were coming together. The climate action, strikes were also happening then. And it was the year, I think, that governments were becoming very fearful of the kind of action they were seeing on the streets, and putting in place immense measures to either legally or through non-legal measures and through non-state actors attack people who were organizing. And then in the third year, I think we saw a really concerted attack on the freedom of association. So organizations started getting targeted in a number of ways. Many countries put in barriers to accessing foreign contributions for NGOs across the world. So it was almost like an economic attack on NGOs and civil society organizations, but also started putting in place lots of restrictions on how associations could operate. So in a way, you were kind of having the dismantling of all the forms in which civic freedoms are exercised: the freedom of expression, the freedom of peaceful assembly, and the freedom of association. And I think the real trigger moment for the global community really was how this has linked to the increase of military aggression and to the increase of the ability of states to dismantle and weaken, the global structures for democracy and rights. The invasion of Ukraine is a classic example of that, but it happened after years of silencing political opposition and civil society in Russia. If you look at the military coups in West Africa, it's again the result of the dismantling of democratic structures. And I think for most people around the world, it became very clear that civic space is not just a nice to have. It has absolutely direct impacts on the life, security, livelihoods of people across the world, and not just in the regions or the geographies that face those conflicts. All of us are facing the result of the energy crisis, the increase in food prices. I mean, people across the world who have nothing to do with a specific region where a conflict occurs are having to deal with the repercussions of that. And you're seeing that even in countries where elections have taken place in a seemingly stable manner, whether it's Senegal or Sierra Leone or Kenya, the level of disruption and instability in the country, because people are just pushing back against the economic hardships and laws, has been extremely high. So I think we're at a point where there is absolutely no excuse to look the other way when civic space is shut down, because it is going to come back and haunt us. And like you said, Minister, the first signal of civic space emergencies is the attack on women and LGBTQ groups. I mean, we've seen what happened in Afghanistan, we've seen what's happening in Iran. And I think there's a real need for us to stand up every time any community is singled out, if ethnic minorities, religious minorities are singled out for repression, because that's just the first signal that that's going to happen to everybody else, and there's going to be, you know, a sense of disruption and instability that we're all going to have to deal with. So having said that, I mean, what are the few things that we can focus on in the coming years, and given the context of the UN General Assembly? I think the whole agenda of de-dollarization raising its head up again through the BRICS plus you know, kind of grouping is something that we are extremely concerned about. I think it's the most direct attack after the Ukraine invasion on the global architecture, governance architecture, and it's something we need to be taking very seriously. I live in South Africa. I was there at, you know, when the summit was happening, and it is extremely concerning. I think it also challenges the notion of global leadership. The multilateral system anyway has been in a disarray because you don't have you know, the traditional forms in which people or leaders organize and act together working anymore. But with these kind of groupings, I think it also says something about the influence that local populations have on their governments. And if more and more countries that are exercising economic influence are countries which are completely closed or repressed in terms of their civic space, what is the opportunity then for us to build transnational solidarity and engage groups, you know, to ensure that their governments do the right thing by the global community? I think the last thing I'll say is that 2024 is going to be a significant moment for the health of democracy. You have national elections in a number of countries, including the US, the UK, India, and South Africa, but there are several more. It would be really important for us, again, you know, like was mentioned earlier, to track the state of democracy during elections, to see how we can actually leverage civil society networks to counter disinformation, to counter propaganda for hate and violence, and to really protect the values that we all stand for. And then the one thing I'm really hopeful about is that 2025 is the time when we will be electing a new Secretary General of the UN. I know at least 5 women leaders who are potential candidates for that. And I think as the global community, we really need to back the call for a first woman Secretary General who is committed to civic space and to the health of civil society. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate how you elevated a key point, which is that emergency measures, whether made in the name of public health or counterterrorism, often seep into legal frameworks and become permanent, normalizing restrictions on civil society and democracy. Thank you also for your call to action. We now have the privilege of hearing from Ulrike Modir. You bring a multidimensional perspective to these issues. Ulrike currently serves as the UN Assistant Secretary General and Director of the Bureau of External Relations and Advocacy of UNDP. You also have a lot of civil society experience and policy experience with government. Thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Foreign Minister Huitfeldt and Norway, and of course then to IPI as well for gathering us here today, and to the co-panelists and all of you being here. There are a lot of interesting, I think, discussions to have on the basis of what we've heard here, and just to say, I mean, as UNDP covering so many countries across the world, we saw also some different trends throughout COVID. We indeed saw also that there was a realization of the importance of civil society at the same time as we saw legislation being changed to actually shrink the same space. We saw an increasing demand actually on UNDP to support governance structures and an ability for us also then to work with the introduction of ideas that could last longer and beyond. UNDP is a development organization with a broad mandate ranging from poverty reduction, addressing the increasing inequalities that we see in societies, and hence also, of course, the problem with the texture of democracy, or what we're aiming for in relation to the realization of human rights. And we are also the organization implementing most of the work in the field of environment and climate change. But interestingly enough, we have also by member states, not too long ago, 2 years ago, when we decided, or member states rather decided in our strategic plan, being also asked to have a human rights-based approach. And you all know that this is quite rare in the UN settings, but I do believe that it also gives us the possibility, as we work on intersectional approaches also to the sustainable development goals, to really find a way alongside with partners to continue to support the structures that need to be in place, but also the culture that has to change based on evidence and experience. Of course, then I would like to share some of the things that we are doing, and I would like to refer you also to, and we're happy also to share later on also links to our website and where you'd find actually more of what I'm going to mention here today. Because today we are launching the first Goal 16 progress report with our partners. And you know, those of you who were accompanying that, Goal 16, of course, was the most difficult goal to get in place. But together with the UN Office on Drugs and Crimes and the UN Human Rights Office, we are launching these reports to really take stock on where we are. And of course, as we've heard, we see really concerning trends, including a 40% increase in killing of human rights defenders, trade unionists, and journalists in 2022 and 2021. The findings, of course, point to the need of urgent action to reverse these current trends and accelerate the implementation of these inclusive strategies that we still believe that we can put in place, based then on arguments that are very rational for governments and other actors trying to meet up with concerning situations in countries. I also believe that we should also remind ourselves what has been possible, as I said, throughout these past years. For instance, the global community has been able to come together in the recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, speaking then to the discussions on environment and climate change. So there are discussions that we can kind of piggyback on and use and leverage, not to always say that everything is doom and gloom, because of course that could also mean that actors are giving up on the importance of using the human rights instruments across the Sustainable Development Goals discussions. As we've heard and as we know, it is actually recognized that civil society is both a driving force in guiding development policies and the much needed watchdog that needs to be in place to ensure that policies get implemented, or at least that lack of implementation is being scrutinized and known. I'm going just briefly to mention 4 elements, once again, with some references to the work that we have ongoing. I mean, you would know that UNDP works a lot with the legal frameworks that have been mentioned. I mean, this is bread and butter in UNDP's work. We support human rights standards and we support institution building in this field in order to make sure that we can have protection systems that actually gives the possibility to safeguard freedom. We are working with the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, and we have provided a toolkit to different actors and member states, where you can actually see then how human rights standards applicable to civic space and guidance on how to ensure national legislative frameworks are aligned with the standards. And we also support at the regional level, and I was also thinking as you were observing the changes that, of course, the SG has warned for years now about the multilateralism a la carte. But still, for us to be relevant, we also really look at the regional spaces, and we have worked with the Escazú Agreement for the Latin American region and also the Aarhus Convention for Europe, to see to that we can effectively use also these regional spaces, monitoring frameworks for human rights defenders, including then not least also the focus we've been mentioning women, but also I would really like you to look at the number also of environmental human rights defenders increasing year by year with regards to the difficult situation that they faced. We also work, of course, with human rights institutions, some of you here in the room as well. And in Africa, also to mention the regional work that we do, we have worked with the tripartite partnership with the national human rights institutions, together with our colleagues from Geneva in OHCHR, and with the African National Human Rights Institutions Network. Conducive environment has been mentioned again and again. This is, of course, vital to see to that we can support the culture of the democratic life. And here we believe that the mechanism for sub-national level is really important. Once again, for instance, in Bangladesh, we have support the capacity of local government institutions. And I think in a number of the discussions that we've had throughout this week, we have also given a lot of emphasis on the importance of growing democratic culture from below. Civil society indeed, but also local government institutions. And then, of course, working across a variety of stakeholders, as we always do in all of these different levels, we believe that we also have to look at the private sector. And I would like to emphasize this, as we also ahead of the seminar here in the morning, we're discussing that as we focus on financing for sustainable development, I think a number of us working in this field, whether from the multilateral institutions or civil society, feel that we need to get into those discussions also in relation to human rights and the institutions that have to be in place. Now, with regards to the possibility for civil society to be that active part in the building of these structures, but also the culture that needs to be in place, we need to look at financing also for civil society. UNDP has small grants programs. We've had it for 3 decades, of course, then supported by Norway and other countries, not least those of you who give also the flexible support for us, which gives us the possibility to really support also community-based organizations and also indigenous organizations, for instance, to really see how we can build knowledge, but also action and hopefully also trust in the field. So this is really important, I think, as well to mention. That is the funding for a variety of civil society organizations and the much needed discussion on the localization of funding and finance for these activities. As we have now passed the midpoint, halfway there, but nowhere near, as we say, we really need to look more closely into how we can use the human rights tools, the institutions, but also the activities that takes place to see how actually this can be some of the best tools that we could have to address some of the most pressing challenges that countries and communities face. So it's really, I think, a good opportunity for us being here in the room, but also in other forums throughout this week, but not least beyond, to get our act together and see how we can use the human rights instruments much more effectively to address pressing problems that countries and people are facing. Thank you.
I particularly appreciate how you've added an SDG dimension to today's discussion, which is extremely important. We will now have a few interventions from the floor so that the audience online can hear you and see you. We'll ask you to step to the lectern to make your intervention. And we'll first hear from Magdalena Andersson, the former Prime Minister of Sweden and leader of the Swedish Social Democratic Party. Former Prime Minister, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for organizing this seminar, and really, really interesting to listen to the panel. So thank you so much for all your interventions. It's an honor to be here and talking about civil society. I mean, it's so many things that can be discussed, and we have to remember it's really one of the most important pillars of a democracy. It is with the civil society, so many people learn how to organize, being given the opportunity to educate themselves, to think by themselves, raise their critical voices. It's also in civil society that we learn new generations how democracy works in practice. It also makes our societies more resilient. We saw it during the pandemic, as you have mentioned. We see it in Ukraine every day. an important part of the Ukrainian resistance, well, of course, they're fantastic military, but it's also how the civil society is able to cope during this war. Why all these advantages of civil society is also the reason why authoritarian movements dislike them so much, because it gives the possibility to people to grow, to rise, and to raise their critical voices. And these movements are increasing in so many countries in the world, in an area of rising inequalities between countries, within countries, leaving many people feeling left behind. Also in an era of growing insecurity when we're in the midst of a really big technical shift. We also have to realize these movements, they are internationally organized, strong networks, and they share methods on how to stop critical voices and undermine civil society. We see actions similar in different countries. It's about threatening individual journalists who criticize these movements or governments if they are in the movement, in government. They threaten NGOs if they criticize government, maybe to threaten to cut their financing. They threaten and spread hate against artists who they find provocative, spreading prejudice against religious minorities, calling LGBTQI persons pedophiles, or cut the political opposition's financing. All these examples are from Sweden. Since a year ago, we do have a government which is formed by 3 traditional parties, but are completely dependent on their cooperation with the second largest party in Swedish parliament, namely the Sweden Democrats, with a right-wing nationalistic extreme movement with Nazi roots. If this can happen in Sweden, it can happen anywhere. So the importance of strong voices against these movements in all countries on the global arena are incredibly important. And I know civil society will be absolutely crucial to fight for freedom and democracy for all. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now hear from Zane Dangor, the Director General of South Africa's Department of International Relations and Cooperation. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting us. Just an apology from my minister, she had to chair another meeting. This topic is close to my heart. I was active in civil society for many years. And in fact, I was the convener of the South African NGO Coalition for Democracy and was instrumental in the shift of civicus from DC to South Africa with Kumi Naidoo. But just to maybe a different set of reflections, because I think the former Prime Minister pointed out what has happened in Sweden can happen anywhere. And what we need to reflect on is that civil society tends to reflect the body of thought in any society. You'll have civil society organizations that are progressive, some who are quite right-wing, some who are quite centrist, and depends on who gets funded more and how the alliances in a particular society unfolds, where the traction holds. So I think we need to bear that out. Civil society is not homogeneous. There's different strata within civil society, and there's a balance of power that is constantly at play within civil society. We can see, for example, the attack on women's human rights, especially reproductive rights, as in the US, in places in Africa, is the culmination of years of advocacy by US-based right-wing NGOs working with states and parliamentarians elsewhere in the world. Well-funded, and I'm not going to mention the names of those institutions, but they are well-funded and they work very effectively transnationally, including within the UN system. So you even have a group of states organized by these NGOs called Friends of the Family. So we do need to look at how these institutions are funded, but also question how do they get the kind of prominence they do have, and why do you have the progressive civil society seemingly becoming weaker? And that's one of the issues that perhaps Civicus and others can tackle. South Africa, for example, is reflective of that. We've got NGOs that are progressive, NGOs center, and NGOs that are quite right-wing. But our constitution provides protection for all, because we also believe that's it's in that diversity that new ideas can emerge, and the battle of ideas is important. So undue restrictions on NGOs that you perhaps don't like is something that we should all refrain from, and I think our constitutional space does that. So in the transnational space, I mentioned, for example, the role of the conservative NGOs on the sexual rights and reproductive rights. But also interestingly, we sometimes see our own political biases come through when NGOs buck the trend. So we've seen what B'Tselem in Israel has done. We've seen what Human Rights Amnesty International has done, and the reports they've put out about Israel as an apartheid state, and the attacks on them coming from the liberal world. So we tend to also support fundamental freedoms when it suits us. When it doesn't suit us, we can easily invoke some of the repressive tools that we don't like. I'm going to end on something that I hope Civicus can do. I think there was a comment on how certain instruments can be used to attack or curtail the activities of civil society. One that we've been concerned about for a while is FATF. The FATF rules have disproportionately tackles the roles of civil society from a financing perspective under the rubric of the war on terror. So many institutions are labeled, depending on the political context, as a terrorist organization, and funding is then removed from it. But the FATF rules needs to be looked at. Many countries are being forced to change enabling legislation to more controlling legislation, because FATF wants to see more control by states. And this is quite a dangerous issue if we don't look at it very carefully. I thought I'll just reflect on those issues a bit more, because I think the inputs from the panel were really extensive. Thank you.
Thank you. And for those who are unfamiliar with the terminology, FATF is the Financial Action Task Force, the global standard-setting body for countering the financing of terrorism and anti-money laundering. Thank you for your thoughtful remarks. We will now turn to Richard Croker, the UK's ambassador to the General Assembly.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to IPI and the Government of Norway for hosting us today. I'm conscious that an event talking about civic space and civil society would be paradoxical for me to stand here and talk from a script for a while and restrict actually what would be a vibrant Q&A in the time we've got left. So let me just say, from a UK perspective, we share the concerns raised by the panel. We see the shrinking space. Bilaterally, we will continue to support human rights defenders around the world, raising cases, monitoring trials, raising with host governments. Multilaterally, we will continue to be a champion of civil society. We will ensure representation in the Security Council. We'll push through modalities. We'll continue to support the work in the Third Committee and the reprisal statements. And we will work kind of on this agenda through our foreign policy, through our development policy around the world. I'll stop there, give space to civil society. Thank you very much.
Wow, that's great. Thank you so much. So we'll now turn to some audience questions. If you would like to make a question, I just ask that you be brief and actually ask a question instead of present a statement. But please, if you could raise your hand, and we would invite you to the podium so that the audience online can both see you and hear you. So what questions do we have, please? Great. Well, we actually have one from our online audience, and it's for you, Minister. So the question is that in some countries, we hear that work to advance the rights of women or the LGBTQI community goes against, quote unquote, traditional values. How do you respond to that argument?
I think the most important thing for Norway is to work with local actors, because there are various measures that we can implement in various countries. For instance, when we work with LGBTI persons organizations in some countries, they tell me not be too vocal, rather talk to your counterpart, but don't do it loudly and don't do it in the press. Other places, they tell me to be vocal and speak out in the press. So we need to adapt to the local conditions. And in very many countries, it has also to do with protect human rights defenders, whether it is in Afghanistan. And they also tell me, continue to engage with the Taliban rather than isolating them, because otherwise you'll make the extremists even more, even less aware of women's opportunities. So we also talk to local leaders in Afghanistan and try to negotiate so women can get better conditions and also get access to schools. So I think there is not only one strategy that we can implement everywhere, but we need to adapt to local conditions. And I think that, I mean, the women's rights and LGBTI plus communities' right has to do, or I always use this as an illustration or an image. In the late 18th, 19th century, the miners took canaries down to the mines. And if there was a lack of not enough oxygen, they would pass away. And this was a signal that the miners had to escape and get out of the mines. And I look at LGBTI plus rights and also women's rights to reproductive health as the canaries in a democracy, where strongmen are very pushy on limiting this space. Because they are trying to make an image of the past, of a better time where the strongmen had much better conditions. And we need to lean backwards to get back to a society where there was order and all this stuff. So therefore, we are working with human rights activists in various countries.
Thank you for a very compelling and persuasive response. Zaid, please.
I don't have a microphone. One of the most prominent human rights defenders who was defending the interests of a local community in Honduras, Berta Cáceres, was murdered a few years ago in a horrible crime. And the funding of this Zarqa Aqua dam was sort of stemmed from two Western banks. To what extent do you think those governments that are committed to a more liberal order, to a more human rights sensitive order, can have a discussion with the corporate sector to say the government policy is one of defending the rights of individuals to express the feelings of a community under pressure, and your funding, without looking at the due diligence requirements, without looking at free, prior and informed consent being sought properly, is abetting, or you become an accessory in event to the suppression of civil society voices on the ground. And is that a space that can be negotiated more effectively?
Yeah, just continue.
Ulrika, would you like to respond initially?
Well, I'm happy to say something. I mean, we have a program called Business and Human Rights, but as we look at the introduction of the broad range of measurements that have to be in place also to have proper standards also in relation across the sustainable development goals, what we see is a proliferation of the market of standards. So I believe that there is much more potential in all of this, but that we need a discussion around this because there are so many standards that companies use throughout their value chains. And then also not least upstream also for the big investors, where maybe there are even more possibilities if we can push based on the examples that we have with also big companies working in our Business for Human Rights program. But the proliferation of the standards introduced to guide companies and investors is a problem and needs to be looked at. And maybe here also member states can be of support.
Thank you, Lisa.
I just wanted to respond, Zain, to your comment about the diversity of civil society. In 2019, we brought out a report on the rise of non-state actors because we've realized now that harassment on rights-based civil society in some contexts is more by non-state actors than state actors. And we've offered a definition that distinguishes NGOs, so the type of organizations registered as NGOs, from civil society. Civil society is necessarily committed to the implementation and achievement of the human rights framework. They recognize the interdependence of rights. So you do not campaign for your own issue at the cost of somebody else's issue. And you do not use violence and harassment as a strategy. And I think it's really important for us to keep reinforcing that distinction, because a lot of people, I think, feel like the civil society space is being delegitimized by the Trojan horse kind of tactics. And we need to call them out. These are non-state actors with vested interests, with clear economic links to the people who require power to be concentrated. And they're not civil society, they're not part of us. And we should call them out like that.
Thank you, Minister.
I just want to focus on what you just said, Ulrika, on human rights defenders, but we also need to include trade unionists when it comes to working with businesses, because they are often threatening authoritarian leaders and also those cooperating closely with business leaders. So these people are being targeted in several countries, and we've seen that, for instance, in Colombia as well. So we also need to work with trade union and businesses. And in Norway, we just adapted the Transparency Act that can also lead to more openness on this. And we work closely with several Norwegian companies operating abroad in order to protect human rights conditions.
Thank you. Sir, if you could please step to the lectern.
Thank you. I'm Craig Charney, Senior Advisor to IPI. I also teach about NGOs and world politics. We've talked about how the frontiers for civil society are contracting and the growing constraints that it's faced. What I'm wondering is if any of the panelists can speak about the most important successes of civil society within the last decade, and also what lessons they might have for civil society actors elsewhere.
Thank you. Lisa?
We bring out a report called the State of Civil Society Report, which will be published for the last 12 years. And that is completely dedicated to the impact and successes of civil society. Ironically, even though in the US, for instance, we're seeing such a big pushback on women's sexual and reproductive health rights, women's rights and LGBTQ rights are actually the most sustained achievement of civil society across the world. Every transition to a better a legal framework or better acknowledgement of rights for these groups has come from civil society. Also on economic justice, the number one trigger for mass protests in the world now is economic, price rises and issues. Again, the ability to organize and demand more accountability and better equity in terms of economic frameworks has again come from the organizing of civil society, not just from trade unions, but now actually from young people across the world. And maybe the last thing I'll say is that the trend that is quite inspiring is that more young people in the world, the first act of democratic act is taking part in a protest, even before they come to the age where they have the right to vote. So I think just the understanding of citizenship, the understanding of the exercise of your public power is all pervasive. I think if we have children and grandchildren and they tell us that we are a more conscious generation than you are, they're absolutely right.
Thank you. And our final intervention, Zain, welcome back.
And thanks, and apologies for taking the floor again, but I think the question Zaid asked is an important one. And one of the issues that I think the gap in international human rights law is the fact that organized business and big business are not seen as rights bearers, duty bearers, they're seen as rights holders only. And in a powerful world where businesses are as powerful, or they're sometimes more powerful than states, and there's no recourse for the abuses that they directly and indirectly are involved in, is something that some of us are quite keen on, and we're tackling in Geneva, we're calling for a binding instrument, because we're finding that the sort of compact issues at times can be more about reputational management than dealing with real human rights abuses. So I think if more states can work with us on these kind of issues where we close that gap in the international human rights architecture, it will actually be a big step forward for protecting human rights defenders as well.
Thank you. This was an extraordinary session, not only because of the exceptional quality of the presentations, thank you all, but also because of the urgency of the topic. The time is now to protect civil society, human rights, and civic space. And we can do so by embracing the UN Secretary General's call to action on public participation and civic space. We don't want to proliferate a new initiative. We already have our roadmap. Simply stated, there are 3 Ps: participation of civil society in UN processes, promotion of laws that empower civil society both online and on land, and the protection of civil society, including against reprisals. In closing, I thank IPI and Norway for convening us today. I thank our speakers for their informative and inspirational remarks. And I thank everyone who has joined us today for your work to advance human rights, civil society, and civic space around the world. Thank you all.